Why doesn't airlines give parachutes or ejector seats to all passengers, or even better, why not fit the aircraft itself with one or more parachutes to help reduce loss of life in a serious aircraft emergency? Now, what I want with this video is to answer these questions seriously, without being dismissive or sarcastic, because although I know that some of these ideas might seem a bit absurd to some of you, I actually do think that out-of-the-box thinking should be encouraged. Stay tuned. So what I'm trying to answer for you today are some of the most persistent questions and suggestions that I see in the comment sections of my videos. And it was actually particularly common in my recent video about the safest seat in an aircraft cabin. And there I also looked at things like seats pointing backwards, front versus rear seats, and aisle seats versus window seats. But curiously, some of you seem to instead prefer ejection seats. Now, before I go any further, I need to make one thing clear here. As pilots, we always assume that we can land the aircraft safely, no matter what the emergency is, maybe with the exception of an out-of-control fire. Every aviation incident or accident during the past 120 plus years have taught us how to operate safer. And that includes studying even the most extreme scenarios that pilots have faced to work out procedures and develop systems that keep everyone safe, even then. But for argument's sake, let's assume that there are indeed some extremely rare cases where abandoning the aircraft might seem like a desirable option. Would offering ejection seats be a good idea in order to achieve that? Well, those kind of seats have existed in some form since the Second World War, with some ideas involving the use of springs or bungee cords going even further back to World War I. Modern ejection seats can even save pilots when their plane is still sitting on the ground, but these seats are also quite a bit violent. Like everything else, operating an aircraft with seats like this involves a serious amount of training. Even members of the public who are invited to ride in jets equipped with these, like journalists or maybe YouTubers for example, have to get trained and equipped properly so that they will have a chance to survive if these seats are actually activated. And by the way, the reason that ejection seats make sense for fighters and other military jets, aside from the training pilots get, is the reality that these jets perform much more dynamic maneuvers than we would ever consider in an airliner. For example, anything beyond 45 degrees of bank in an airliner is considered an upset, while fighters don't seem to mind going even upside down. And of course, military jets also go somewhere where others might not like them very much, which might increase the odds for those ejection seats being needed. This also explained why even larger military jets, like the B-52 bomber for example, also have those type of seats. But does that mean that other large jets, like airliners, could be fitted with ejection seats for passengers as well? Well, despite its size, the B-52 only has 6 ejection seats, and all jets with such seats need to fire them in specific sequences so that the ejection of one crew member doesn't hurt someone else, and also so that 2 ejections don't interfere with each other. This means that, among other things, there needs to be a delay between one ejection seat firing and the next one in line, which is normally around 1 to 2 seconds, depending on the seat and the aircraft. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. A second or two between the ejections of 2 or 4 seats might be acceptable, but consider what the firing sequence of, let's say, 120 airliner passenger seats would look like. Can you imagine? Just for one thing, it would take quite a while to do. With just a 1 second delay, the last of these 120 passengers would need to wait patiently for everyone else to go for 2 minutes. An eternity in a situation where the pilots have lost control, for example. Now, on the technical side of things, presumably there would need to be some sort of hatch in the fuselage above each passenger, and I guess that would mean no overhead lockers, so no carry-on bags, and we would also have to figure out what to do with the oxygen masks. And we haven't even started to mention the weight increase for each seat, which would be around 100 kilos extra per passenger. So either we only carry half of the amount of passengers, or the aircraft would need to be built in a completely new way. probably both. Finally, we need to also consider the physical demands of using such a feature. Even with the best training possible, the body of someone ejecting from a military jet still has to undergo double-digit G-forces for a few seconds. This means that spine injuries aren't uncommon for ejecting military flight crews, and that especially if they weren't able to get their body in an ideal position in the seat before they or someone else pulled the handle. So, what do you think are the odds of 120 people avoiding such serious injuries, especially since passengers will include people of all ages, sizes and physical fitness? Now, of course, having said all of that, I still haven't touched on an important bit that happens after the ejection, which is the parachute ride down and landing. But we're going to look at that in our second scenario, which is giving all passengers their own parachute. Now, I understand completely where that idea might come from. It would seem intuitively logical, especially after having seen videos like the one from last January, when a door plug suddenly blew out from a Boeing aircraft leaving Portland. The NTSB preliminary report later revealed that 4 bolts securing the door in place had not been fitted after a repair. A small oversight that could have easily ended up with someone desperately needing a parachute. That whole story and its potentially devastating consequences really shows how important it is with transparency when things like that happens. And we only really get that when we get to see the same story from multiple different angles. And that's why I am so happy to have Ground News as the sponsor of this video. Just check out ground.news/mentor to compare the NTSB report on this accident alongside with all of the different media perspectives on it, with their ownership, credibility and bias. It's really quite fascinating. Exactly because of news like this, Ground News has been my go-to app and website for tracking breaking aviation stories, since they immediately provide me with multiple angles, which gives me more info than any single article ever could. I have seen your comments on how frustrated you are with the sensationalism and lack of context in today's media landscape, and I can't emphasize enough how powerful a tool Ground News can be to tackle that. You can also use them to track your favorite topic, whether that's aviation, tech or even politics. So to try it out yourself, go to ground.news/mentor or scan this QR code. That will give you almost half price on the Vantage plan that I've been using for years. That's only $5 per month to keep yourself properly informed and help support this independent platform, as well as me. Thank you, Ground News. Now let's get back to those passengers and their parachutes. Now, compared to an ejection, a parachute jump would be a lot less stressful for the body, which maybe might seem a little bit promising. But before we can look into that, we have to solve another problem. How do you even get everyone out of the aircraft? In most airliners, main cabin doors open towards the front of the aircraft, meaning that they either have to rotate forward about 180 degrees, like on the 737 that I fly, or they have to do kind of like a parallelogram motion, sort of a sliding forward as they do in the Airbus A320 family and also in bigger jets like the Boeing 777. This means that those doors would need to open against the airstream, and even in slow flights during the approach to land, for example, we could be doing around 150 knots or 280 kilometers per hour. So this means that the door and whoever is operating it would need to be able to beat that airflow. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Boeing's 767, for example, that has doors who actually open by sliding upwards inside of the cabin, so they wouldn't really have to fight the airstream. But all of those designs are what we call plug-type doors, which means that they are slightly bigger than the frame that they're sitting in. In practice, this means that even if they twist, lift or turn in a way that allows them to get outside of the cabin, all of these doors needs to first move slightly inwards, which is intentional. You see, the pressure of the aircraft cabin is always higher than the pressure outside, which means that, especially at higher cruising altitudes, for example, it would literally take superhuman strength for someone to open a door. And even if they actually had that strength, they would probably break the door handle before the door actually moved. Now, I am skipping some details here. For example, the overwing exits of many aircraft that aren't plug type, so they would have locks which allow them to open under specific circumstances, depending on whether the plane is on the ground or is operating its engines. But there was actually a recent case of a passenger who managed to open an emergency exit in flight on an Asiana Airlines Airbus A321. This was possible because the aircraft was on approach at the time and therefore had a much smaller differential pressure than normal, and the Airbus doors also have an assist mechanism which could have helped. And if you want to know more about that particular incident, then check out this Mentor Pilot video. Anyway, going back to our parachute plans here. So if we actually wanted to allow the doors to open, we would first need to depressurize the aircraft, and of course not be in an aircraft whose doors swing open like the 737 or 757. On top of that, the door would likely also need to have a system that assists the operator to open the door fully, and then we would need to choose our doors quite carefully. You wouldn't, for example, want to use the front door, since from there you could end up getting sucked straight into an engine, and rear doors might seem more promising, but now you might be a little bit too close to the tail and the horizontal stabilizer. In practice, if we were going to do this, the aircraft would need to be designed specifically to make such an emergency mid-air evacuation possible. But even if we did that, there are still a few more problems to overcome. The duration of this mid-air evacuation would obviously be even slower than if we had ejection seats. So again, a 120-seat aircraft would need to be flying nice and steadily for 3 or 4 minutes before anyone could even begin to leave the aircraft. And beyond that, even dedicated parachute operations with smaller aircraft sometimes go wrong because a lot of parachutists end up sitting together too far at the rear of the cabin. And that can shift the aircraft center of gravity too far to the rear, making it completely unstable. Now, even if that wouldn't happen, occasionally parachutists have issues with their equipment that they of course need proper training to deal with, or they do suffer from broken legs and other injuries due to bad landings. And that's obviously when performing a planned, fully briefed jump with everyone having plenty of practice in how to open the parachute and how to control its descent, all done in daytime and of course after selecting and preparing a suitable flat soft landing area. So if we gave people parachutes, we would definitely need to update the usual safety briefing with a really detailed breakdown on how to use them, and then hope that people actually pay attention to it. But having said that, even if that was the case, how well would this process go at night, over a forest, water or even a city, after jumping from an aircraft flying possibly erratically with terrified people who have never practiced using a parachute before? And of course by people, we could be talking about 10-year-old children, babies or even grandma. I think you get the idea. Even in a normal evacuation of an aircraft on a runway using the slides, we expect a certain proportion of the passengers to suffer injuries during the evacuation itself. This is a big reason why we only evacuate if it's absolutely necessary. And that's even though we know that the aircraft is a controlled environment where we know also that there are trained rescue personnel standing by. Now, I am not a parachutist, but if you are, I'd be really interested to hear what proportion of injuries you think would be expected from something like this. Oh, and while you're down there making your comments, please like and subscribe to the channel as well. Okay, so having looked at that scenario, now let's look at what might first, at least at the first glance, look like a more plausible thing to do. Fitting the entire aircraft with a parachute, or designing the aircraft so that the cabin is detachable with its own sets of parachutes. Now, this is an idea that makes its rounds on social media from time to time, and I am always tagged in a lot of those posts. To start with, this would obviously need to be a purpose-built aircraft design, and as a bonus with this idea, it would also separate the passengers from the fuel tanks in the wings. But one very obvious drawback is that this system would also increase the aircraft's weight tremendously. It would very likely have to be a high-wing design, and even normal high-wing aircraft are generally heavier than equivalent low-wing designs because of the separate wing box and landing gear structure. But even with those aircraft, the fuselage and cabin are structurally integral to the wing, the gear and the rest of the aircraft. So with a cabin that separates, we would need to strengthen, well, basically everything even more so that the part keeps structurally sound when separated. And for the separated cabin, we would then need even more strengthening so that it can withstand the launch of the parachutes, which is a fairly violent process. Now technically, both of these ideas, parachutes for the whole plane or a separated occupant section, already exists. Well, sort of. Some military planes actually have a detachable cockpit instead of ejection seats, and there are also smaller aircraft that come with parachutes, big enough to support the whole plane. Earlier versions of such systems have existed since the 1980s, but I think that the first aircraft to popularize plane chutes was the Cirrus SR-20 and the SR-22, which has actually been around for 25 years by now. According to the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System, or CAPS, have been activated successfully 132 times as we record this video, which is quite impressive. Now this system is activated by the pilot pulling a handle in the roof of the cabin which fires a rocket housed in the rear of the fuselage, which in turn deploys the parachute. This arrangement is necessary because this is quite a big parachute. The aircraft weighs around 1.4 tons or just over 3,000 pounds gross, so the parachute needed for this kind of weight has a diameter of 16.8 meters or 55 feet, and that's just for 4 people. Obviously the size of the chute depends on the weight of the object that we suspend under it, but it can also vary based on competing factors like the weight of the chute mechanism and things like how fast we will be traveling when we pop the chute, and of course the descent rate that we want. On that note, bear in mind here that 55-foot chute for the Cirrus is actually quite small for its size, so its descent rate on the canopy is around 10 meters per second or 1,700 feet per minute, which is pretty fast. It basically leads to a controlled crash, not a gentle landing, and the Cirrus relies on its landing gear and specially designed seats to protect the occupants during impact. So this means that the cabin section that we separate from our airliner will also need a good bit of cushioning, either the landing gear or airbags or perhaps more rockets that can fire just before touchdown. That's actually something that the space capsules like Soyuz do in order to touch down safely on land. They call these gentle touchdowns, but they don't look that gentle from the outside, and they also depend on crew seats that raise automatically, adding more cushioning. So the question now becomes, how big would the canopy of a parachute or parachutes have to be for an airliner cabin? Well, we can't really know that answer exactly since we don't know the weight of this cabin, but based on the weight of, let's say, 180 passengers and assuming a descent rate similar to that of the Cirrus, even 20 Cirrus-sized parachutes wouldn't be enough, and that's assuming that they all deploy correctly. So to be perfectly honest, a more important question here is, what is actually the point of all of this? Would we be any safer if airliners were designed this way? Well, to start with, whether we abandon the plane in chutes or eject the cabin, the rest of the plane then has to fall down somewhere, presumably out of control, which honestly doesn't sound like a great idea. But more fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves exactly what scenario would have to happen in order for it to make sense to leave the aircraft and try our lucks in a parachute instead. Like I said at the very beginning, all of our systems and procedures are designed to make sure that we, the pilots, can bring you and ourselves back to the ground safely. And that's even with some really bad failures, which are in themselves exceedingly rare. So I personally can't see when all of these chutes, new doors for parachuting or super heavy detachable cabins would even be useful. The only possibility I can think of would be some kind of black swan event, like a structural failure rendering the aircraft impossible to fly, or, like I said, an uncontrolled fire in the cabin. But if that would happen, well then we wouldn't be able to safely evacuate the passengers anyway, and the speed might also be way too high. Speed is important here because, for example, in the case of the Cirrus, some deployments have failed because the aircraft was just flying too fast. The chute's speed limit is lower than the aircraft's maximum cruise speed, which again was a necessary compromise to keep the size and weight of the system realistic. And that's even though we're only talking about a 4-seater plane here. So if the aircraft is controllable enough either to allow an orderly parachute evacuation or a cabin ejection, would it not make more sense to just try to land at an airport instead? And by the way, whenever you introduce new, complex systems like this to an aircraft, you also run the risk of things happening that you didn't intend to. For example, with the Cirrus again, there have been 2 recorded instances where the chute activated involuntarily on the ground due to nearby lightning strikes. Now, in a single-engine piston airplane like the Cirrus, even a risk like that still makes the system a worthwhile addition because it has clearly proven its worth over the years. But airliners with 2 reliable jet engines and multiple redundancies of every critical system have a safety record that is many times better than that of general aviation. And that, plus the sheer size of our planes, which would make any such system incredibly complicated with many potential failure points, ultimately means that no. It simply doesn't make sense to introduce anything like this, because it simply wouldn't make aviation any safer than it already is today, only more expensive and environmentally unfriendly. I think that the thought about the need for parachutes actually comes from a misconception about how safe it actually is to fly. If it was really dangerous, then maybe we would have to look at these types of solutions, but given the extreme levels of safety that we now have, adding parachutes or similar things to aircraft is just not effective, smart, or even feasible. But what do you think? Do you have any other questions that you would like me to cover on this channel? Let me know in the comments below, because as you can see, we do read your comments, and if you feel like something is worth covering in a video, well, then we do just that. But if you want to be even more hands-on to help me out, then consider joining my Patreon crew. You'll get to see all videos before everyone else and have a direct line of communication to the team and me for possible improvements. Now, check out the description here below for links to our sponsor as well as a lot of other awesome things. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.